Welcome to Dead Quiet Mysteries, the place where every cold case, chilling crime, and unsolved mystery is brought back to life. From vanished persons to twisted betrayals, we dig deep into the unknown to uncover the truth that others left buried. Before we begin, drop a comment and tell us which city and country you're watching from. We love seeing how far the mystery travels. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell icon so you never miss a case. Because here, some truths are only heard in the dead quiet. Hercule Poirot and the Blossom Case, Chapter 1. The Tea at Hawthorn Lane. The air in Little Harborough was still as though holding its breath. Spring had brought with it a cautious sun, the kind that only half-warmed stone cottages and gave the illusion of comfort. A gentle breeze stirred the wild hawthorn hedges lining the narrow lane, and the bell at St. Jude's Church had just finished tolling 2 o'clock when Hercule Poirot, impeccably dressed as always, arrived at Hawthorn Lane. The detective was not in the habit of accepting countryside invitations lightly, but this one had been peculiar. A brief note from Miss Beatrice Langton, a woman entirely unknown to him, delivered in a heavy cream envelope with a stiff hand. Monsieur Poirot, I should be honoured if you would join me and a few guests for tea this coming Sunday. I find myself troubled by certain matters from the past. Your presence may bring clarity. Yours faithfully, Beatrice Langton. There had been something in the phrasing, matters from the past, clarity, that piqued Poirot's curiosity. And so, on the third day of his sojourn at the Hare and Fern Inn, he had donned his grey suit with the blue satin tie, polished his shoes to a mirror, and walked the half-mile to Hawthorn Lane. The house itself was precisely what one might expect of a retired schoolmistress's residence, angular, modestly grand, with ivy-clad windows and a walled garden neat to the point of rigidity. A white wicker table had been arranged on the back patio, facing the garden. Bone china teacups gleamed in the sun, and a plate of slightly uneven scones rested beside an unopened jar of damson jam. Miss Langton stood waiting. She was tall, with an erect bearing that had clearly once held authority. Her greying hair was pulled tightly into a chignon, and her dress was of navy crepe, old-fashioned but meticulously pressed. Her face held no softness, though there was a certain intelligence in her pale eyes. "Ah, Monsieur Poirot," she said, "thank you for coming." "You are most welcome, Mademoiselle Langton," Poirot replied, bowing slightly. "Your invitation intrigued me, and I find that curiosity is often the first step toward discovery." "Let us hope so." She turned. "You will meet the others." The others arrived shortly after, each announced with a glance from Miss Langton, but no introductions. There was Mr. Harold Seaton, lean and dry, with sharp eyes and yellowed fingers that spoke of habitual pipe smoking. He wore a bow tie far too tight for his thick neck. Reverend Simon Drake came next, his mild manner offset by hands that never stopped fiddling with the buttons of his coat. His spectacles slid down his nose every few minutes. Miss Miriam Langton, Beatrice's niece, followed quietly. She was in her early 30s, attractive in a subdued way, with a pale green dress and a leather-bound book under her arm. Her expression was unreadable. Last came Mrs. Edna Hodge, a stout woman with a waddling walk and the air of someone always slightly affronted. Tea was poured, scones were offered. The conversation danced awkwardly between topics: the weather, the parish fundraiser, the misbehaving vicarage dog. Poirot listened politely, but spoke little. He noticed the way Miss Miriam looked out across the garden, detached, and how Seaton never once took his eyes off Beatrice Langton. It was just as the second cup of tea was being served that Miss Langton stood. "I have something I wish to share," she said. Her voice had taken on a curious tremor, not of fear, but of weight. "It is not pleasant, but necessary." All conversation ceased. She reached into her handbag and produced a single folded paper, thick, yellowing, with blue ink. "This," she said, "is an excerpt from my brother Edward's journal." It came into my possession only recently, and it contains a confession. I feel it would be dishonest, unchristian even, to keep it hidden." Poirot leaned ever so slightly forward. Miss Langton unfolded the paper, adjusted her spectacles, and began to read aloud. 14 April 1913. "Today I did it. I took her to the quarry path just as the sun was dipping low. She trusted me. Poor Eliza. She always trusted me. But she would not let it go. She wanted to tell Beatrice. She would have ruined everything. I had no choice. I pushed her. It was quick. No one saw. The path will cover the truth." A stunned silence followed. Miss Miriam's hands froze on her teacup. Mrs. Hodge coughed once and stared down. The Reverend blinked rapidly. Mr. Seton shifted in his seat and reached for his pipe. Poirot, expressionless, simply tilted his head. Miss Langton folded the paper again. "I do not know who Eliza was. I do not know what my brother meant to do, but I can no longer live with the possibility that something wicked was buried and left unspoken." She paused, as if waiting for a reaction. None came. Only the wind stirred the hedge behind them. And then, very slowly, Miss Langton's face drained of colour. She reached for her teacup, faltered, and sat down heavily. "Miss Langton?" Poirot said, rising. But already she was leaning sideways, one hand clenching at her chest, the other twitching at the edge of the tablecloth. Miriam leapt to her feet, knocking over her chair. The Reverend called her name. It was over in seconds. Miss Beatrice Langton collapsed into the arms of her niece. Her breathing stuttered, once, then twice, and ceased altogether. Poirot knelt beside her. His fingers went to her wrist. He looked up after a moment, sombre. "She is dead." There was a collective gasp. The Reverend made the sign of the cross. Poirot stood. His face had grown hard. "This was not a fainting spell, mes amis. This, I believe, was poison." And the garden, so peaceful only moments ago, suddenly felt cold and grim beneath the pale spring sun. Chapter 2. A village of glances. Constable Gibbs arrived within the hour, summoned from the station at Lower Winsley, his bicycle still leaning against the Langtons' gate when Poirot returned to the drawing-room. The body of Miss Beatrice Langton had been respectfully covered with a woolen blanket and moved to the Chesterfield beneath the tall bay window. Her niece, Miriam, had retreated upstairs, her face pale and set. "Poison, you say?" Gibbs asked, scratching his cheek beneath the brim of his helmet. "She didn't eat anything different to the rest of you?" "No," Poirot replied. "We all partook of the same scones, the same jam, the same tea, though she poured her own." And what about this paper? The brother's confession?" Poirot handed it to him. Gibbs read it with a slowly rising brow. "Well now," he said, exhaling through his teeth. "If this is genuine, then that makes two crimes. The old one and the new." "That, my good friend, is precisely the question," said Poirot, his voice low. "Is it genuine, or was it crafted to appear so?" The constable gave him a puzzled look. Poirot did not elaborate. By the following morning, news of the incident had travelled the length of Little Harborough and halfway back again. The church bell tolled longer than usual. Windows remained half-shuttered. Mrs. Cullingford, who ran the post office, told every customer the same thing. She was sitting upright one moment, gone the next, stone cold. It was terrible, just terrible. Poirot, never one to let the dust settle on a corpse without examination, made his way that afternoon to the lavender tea-room, where he had arranged a quiet conversation with the village vicar, Reverend Simon Drake. They sat by the window, a pot of Earl Grey between them. The vicar had a face too youthful for his collar, gentle eyes, a slightly uncertain manner. But his hands, Poirot noted, were still. "You were present at the gathering," Poirot said, pouring the tea. "Did you notice anything peculiar about Miss Langton's behaviour prior to her collapse?" Reverend Drake considered. "Only her tone. She was more, how should I say, more purposeful than usual. She had that air of someone making a statement she had rehearsed many times, but I'd assumed it was nerves. You believe she found the confession only recently? She told me about it last week, actually, the vicar said, stirring his cup. She said she'd found her brother's old trunk in the attic, moth-eaten books and personal papers, nothing else of note. Poirot arched an eyebrow. And she told you of the contents of this paper? She said she was debating whether to destroy it or read it aloud. She wanted to stir consciences, perhaps seek absolution for her family, I think. Curious, murmured Poirot. It is not often one uncovers a murder confession and chooses a tea party as the setting for revelation. Reverend Drake managed a strained smile. Beatrice was never one to do things half-heartedly. That afternoon, Poirot paid a visit to the now quiet Hawthorn Lane. Miriam Langton greeted him at the door. She wore a black dress, though her mourning was too freshly worn to be convincing. You wish to speak with me, Monsieur Poirot? If you are willing, mademoiselle. She nodded and led him into the parlour. The room had been tidied, the china removed, the chairs realigned, the blanket folded neatly over the back of the settee. She was proud, Miriam said, sitting upright. Always so proper, even after her retirement. She said the house must never look neglected, not even after death. Poirot took a seat opposite. Your aunt was a formidable woman. May I ask, did you know of the so-called confession? No, Miriam said quickly, almost too quickly. I saw it for the first time when she read it aloud. I'd never heard of Eliza Hartwell, nor have I ever seen Uncle Edward's journal. Poirot clasped his fingers. Forgive me, mademoiselle, but did you not find the moment theatrical, as though it were a play and we the audience? She hesitated. Yes, but that was her way. Everything was a performance. Yet performances, Poirot said softly, require intention. And intention in this case may have cost her her life. Her lips tightened. You think someone killed her? I think someone feared what she might say next, or reveal. A beat of silence. I've already told the constable everything I know, Miriam said. I brought down the tea service, I arranged the flowers, and I sat beside Mrs. Hodge. I noticed nothing strange. Poirot nodded, but his gaze lingered. You are fond of books, I see, he said, gesturing to a shelf behind her. They're mostly hers. But yes, I read a little. Poetry, some history. Handwriting. Would that be something you are familiar with? Your aunt's, for example. Yes, of course. Poirot reached into his coat and drew out the folded confession. He placed it on the table between them. Would you say this is her brother's handwriting? Miriam leaned forward. She examined the sloping lines, the exaggerated capitals. It's similar, but there's something odd. My uncle's letters, the few I've seen, were more rigid. This feels like an imitation. Poirot gave a slight smile. Merci, mademoiselle. Later that day, Poirot found himself standing beneath the budding hawthorn hedge, his eyes narrowed in the soft light of late afternoon. Two things disturbed him greatly. First, the ink used on the confession, rich, violet-tinted, was of a brand known only to the most particular stationers and quite modern. Hardly the sort of thing likely to survive untouched in an attic trunk for decades. Second, the cup from which Beatrice had sipped, now under examination by Constable Gibbs, had a faint chip along the rim. Poirot remembered it clearly because it was the only cup she'd poured for herself. He remembered, too, the blossoms placed on each saucer. Tiny sprigs of apple blossom. A delicate touch, all but one. That evening, he wrote a note and had it delivered to Mrs. Edna Hodge, inviting her to tea the following morning. The time had come to stir the waters, gently, for now. But Poirot, master of the ripple, knew that even a whisper could unmask a scream. Chapter 3. The girl who was never there. It was a bright morning in Little Harborough, but despite the cheer in the air, Hercule Poirot walked with gravity. The hedgerows were dotted with early blossom, and birdsong floated over the chapel roof, but his mind was firmly occupied with the name Eliza Hartwell. She had been the centerpiece of Edward Langton's so-called confession, a woman allegedly murdered in 1913. Yet Poirot, with all his precise logic, could find no trace of her in any official record. No birth, no death, no mention in the parish archive, no gravestone in the churchyard. It was as if Eliza Hartwell had never existed. His first visit of the morning was to St. Jude's Church, where Reverend Drake awaited him in the vestry. The air inside was cool, filtered through old stone and the faint scent of beeswax polish. Reverend Drake had laid out a box of old school registers, church bulletins, and vestry minutes from the years surrounding 1913. "I thought these might be of use," he said. "Beatrice's brother, Edward Langton, taught at the grammar school before he left for the war." "Merci," Poirot said, lifting a register and flipping carefully through the thick, yellowing pages. "Did he teach long?" "From 1908 to 1915, I believe. Then he enlisted. Wounded in the Somme, if memory serves. Came back a changed man." Poirot paused. "And Miss Hartwell?" "You have no recollection?" "None," Drake said. "I asked the church clerk too. No Eliza Hartwell ever attended services here. Nor do we have a grave of that name." "Curious indeed," murmured Poirot. "For a woman supposedly murdered here, she has left no trace." He turned a page, pausing at a staff photograph of the school from 1912, a row of stern-looking gentlemen in suits and high collars. And in the center, a woman. She was not labeled. A young woman with tightly curled hair, wearing a pale dress with lace at the collar. Her expression was unsmiling, and her hands were folded neatly in her lap. Poirot tapped the image. "This lady, do you know who she is?" The vicar leaned closer. "I believe that's Miss Radley, the shorthand teacher. She left before the war." Poirot studied her. The face was plain, indistinct. Yet there was something haunting about her posture, as though she knew she didn't quite belong in the frame. He made a mental note. By midday, Poirot was seated across from Mrs. Edna Hodge at the lavender tea room, the floral wallpaper a contrast to the taut lines of her face. He had not needed to press her, merely suggest he had questions, and she had filled the gaps with her own nerves. "I didn't want to come at first," she said, stirring her tea far too quickly. "But you left that note and, well, I've never liked secrets." "Ah, but madame," Poirot said smoothly, "secrets are the glue of village life, n'est-ce pas?" She gave a dry laugh. "Some secrets, yes, but Beatrice had no right to stir up what should have been left buried." "You believe she invented the confession?" "I don't know," Edna said, glancing about the tea room. "I do know she was clever, very clever, and vindictive." "Did she mention Eliza Hartwell to you?" "Never. And I lived next door to her for 30 years. If there had been a murder in 1913, this village would have dined out on it for generations." Poirot nodded slowly. "You mentioned in your note that you saw Miss Langton writing?" Edna grew visibly uncomfortable. "It was late, just after Easter. I saw her in the back study. She had a journal open, not a book I recognized, but she was copying from another piece of paper, dipping her pen in violet ink." "And you said nothing?" "I thought it wasn't my business." Poirot sipped his coffee. "But now you believe it might be?" She nodded. "Yes, because now she's dead." Poirot returned to Hawthorn Lane just as the sun reached its peak. Miriam answered the door again, her face drawn. "There's someone who wishes to see you," she said, "in the parlour." Poirot entered and found Harold Seaton standing stiffly near the mantel, hat in hand. "Good day, monsieur," Poirot said. "I trust this is not merely a social call?" Seaton looked around, then cleared his throat. "I was here the other day. I heard what she read, and I want to say something before it festers." Poirot gestured for him to sit. "Please, Seaton did so reluctantly. Years ago, Beatrice and we courted briefly. She hoped for more than I could offer. I chose someone else. It was messy, hurtful. Poirot tilted his head. You believe the confession was revenge? I think she enjoyed watching us squirm, Seaton said darkly. Especially Miriam. You may not know this, but Miriam's mother, Beatrice's younger sister, died under questionable circumstances, and Beatrice raised Miriam as her own. Poirot's gaze sharpened. And you believe there is a link? I think Beatrice wanted to stir up guilt, perhaps in me, perhaps in Miriam, and now she's paid the price for it. Poirot rose slowly. Monsieur Seaton, I am most grateful. You have given me a thread, and I shall pull it gently. Seaton stood, nodded curtly, and left without another word. That evening, Poirot sat by the fire in the Hare and Fern Inn, his notebook open. No Eliza Hartwell existed. The name, it seemed, had been plucked from thin air. The ink was modern, the handwriting inconsistent. The reactions of the guests, particularly Miriam's, bore watching. But one thing troubled him more than anything else. If Beatrice had forged the confession to provoke emotion, who had panicked enough to kill her? He closed the notebook, folded his hands, and whispered to himself, There is a lie at the heart of this village, and soon it will come into the light. Chapter 4. The Vicar and the Violet Ink. The morning after Harold Seaton's confession, Poirot rose earlier than usual. The countryside air, as ever, was sharp and fresh, but he gave it little thought. His mind was already turning over a dozen possibilities, each more tantalizing than the last. If Beatrice Langton had indeed fabricated the confession, then it begged a delicate question. For whom was the lie intended, and why did it get her killed? Only one thing was clear. Whoever had administered the poison had acted out of fear. By 9 o'clock, Poirot was standing once more outside the modest stone rectory of Reverend Simon Drake. The vicar answered the door himself in shirt sleeves, spectacles dangling from a cord. Ah, Monsieur Poirot, is everything? I shall not take long, Poirot said, stepping inside with a gentle firmness, but I have a question and a request. The vicar led him into the small study. It was sparsely furnished. 2 chairs, a desk cluttered with theological texts, and a high window that let in cold grey light. A kettle simmered gently on a side-table burner. You said, when last we spoke, that Miss Langton came to you seeking moral clarity. Yes? Drake nodded slowly. She was troubled by what she'd found, or claimed to find. Poirot's gaze moved carefully over the room. He saw a small glass bottle of violet ink, a fountain pen still uncapped beside it. You write in violet, Reverend? Drake followed his glance and smiled faintly. A harmless eccentricity. I find the colour soothing. Poirot picked up the bottle, holding it to the light. Interesting. The same shade as that in the confession paper. The vicar's expression changed. Are you suggesting? I suggest nothing, not yet. Only that Beatrice's so-called confession was written in ink of identical tone. Violet, of that specific density, is not common. Perhaps she borrowed it. Perhaps. Poirot set the bottle down. He paced, hands behind his back. Tell me honestly, Monsieur Drake, do you believe Miss Langton was a woman of truth? The vicar hesitated. She was a woman of principle, not necessarily of humility. Would she lie? Drake exhaled. To expose someone else's weakness? Yes. Especially if she believed it served a higher moral end. Poirot turned to face him squarely. And what do you believe the purpose of the confession was? To shame someone, the vicar said without hesitation. That's why she read it aloud. Not to inform, to wound. Poirot studied him. And whom did she intend to wound? The answer came after a long pause. Miriam, he said. She always held her niece to impossible standards. She once told me Miriam had disappointed her potential. Ah, said Poirot. La fierté? the pride of the disappointed, Poirot left the rectory thoughtful. Outside, the village seemed unaware of the tension threading through its centre. Children chased a dog past the green. Mrs. Cullingford was hanging bunting for an upcoming charity bazaar. But Poirot noticed small things. A window curtain flicked aside as he passed, the way Mr. Seaton crossed the street to avoid speaking, the stiff smile on Edna Hodges' face as she swept her porch. Little Harborough was closing in on itself. And that meant the truth was very near. Back at the inn, Poirot sat before his breakfast untouched. He took out the photograph from the school archive, the one with the unknown woman in the centre, and laid it flat beside the confession letter. He compared the shapes of letters in both. The confession was, as he suspected, written in a disguised hand. Letters slanted oddly, loops exaggerated. But one thing had escaped the forger, a natural flourish on the lowercase f, present in both the letter and a sample signature he had borrowed discreetly from Beatrice Langton's discarded cheque stub. Beatrice had written the confession. There could be no doubt now. So the next question: who discovered the lie and silenced her before she could explain further? He was still pondering when a knock came at the door. It was Miriam. "I didn't want to come," she said, stepping inside with visible unease. "But I found something in the pantry this morning. It may be nothing, but—" She handed him a small square of paper, scorched around the edges but still legible in part. "She wants to speak to Harold. I know she does. If she tells him everything, it will ruin it all. But she won't. She hasn't the courage. She never did." Poirot's eyes widened slightly. "Where did you find this?" "Behind a tin of flour. I think it had been burned and dropped." He turned it over. "Same violet ink?" "Yes, like the confession." Poirot stood abruptly. "Mademoiselle Langton, you have done well." "Does this help?" "It does more than help. It tells me someone else knew of the forgery and was watching Miss Langton very closely. Perhaps too closely." He folded the note. "Tell me, does your aunt have a cellar?" "A coal cellar, yes. She kept old trunks and things down there." "Why?" Poirot gave a rare, sly smile. "Because people who bury lies often do so literally." That afternoon, Poirot descended the narrow cellar steps of Hawthorn Lane with a torch in one hand and gloves on the other. Miriam waited upstairs. The space was damp, the walls lined with old crates, paint tins, gardening tools. But tucked into the far corner, under a tattered sheet, a second painting. He drew back the cover, a portrait, faded, roughly done, but unmistakable in subject. A younger Beatrice Langton, her face twisted in rage, one hand clutching a letter. And opposite her, a woman, plain, with tightly curled hair and sad eyes. The same unknown figure from the school photograph. Poirot stared. "Eliza Hartwell," he murmured. "Or a version of her." So Beatrice had painted this, not to display, to remember, or to haunt. And behind the frame, taped to the back, a folded note. He read it once, then twice, and with each word, the pieces slid softly into place. That evening, Poirot wrote one final letter, this time addressed to Constable Gibbs. "Dear Monsieur, kindly gather all parties tomorrow morning at Hawthorn Lane. The drawing room, if you please. I shall offer you not only a killer, but the true identity of Eliza Hartwell, and the motive for murder, both past and present. Yours sincerely, Hercule Poirot." Chapter 5. A Second Confession. The following morning dawned cool and mist-veiled, the hills around Little Harborough smudged like charcoal under a leaden sky. At Hawthorn Lane, the drawing room had been quietly prepared. Chairs had been drawn into a gentle arc around the hearth. The tea service was absent, and so too the usual comforting smells of rosewood polish and burnt sugar. Instead, the air was charged, still, like the last hush before a summer storm. Constable Gibbs stood awkwardly by the mantelpiece, notebook in hand but eyes flickering. Seated stiffly beside him was Harold Seaton, his jaw tight, pipe unlit. Miriam Langton, in dark green, kept her gaze down. Reverend Drake arrived last, murmuring a quiet greeting before taking a seat near the window. Mrs. Hodge was conspicuously absent, and then, precisely on time, Hercule Poirot entered. He gave a polite bow, adjusted the cuffs of his immaculate dove-grey suit, and stood before them with hands clasped behind his back. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, "I thank you for gathering. I know emotions are still raw from the loss of Mademoiselle Langton, but I assure you, what we uncover today will bring not only justice, but clarity." Harold Seaton gave a short, impatient cough. Poirot's gaze rested on him. "Monsieur Seaton, you were once engaged in sentiment, if not in vow, to the late Miss Langton, were you not?" Seaton frowned. "That's no secret." "And she loved you, but felt betrayed?" Seaton shifted. "It was over 50 years ago." "Oui, but wounds left untended often fester. Miss Langton, I believe, bore that wound for the rest of her life." He turned to the rest. "She did not in truth discover a journal written by her brother. No such item exists. The confession she read aloud was her own creation, composed in recent weeks with modern ink, and disguised in a trembling hand meant to mimic age. But there is more." Poirot withdrew from his coat a folded note. "This was found in the coal cellar behind the frame of a painting hidden from view. A portrait of two women, one recognizable as Miss Langton, the other unknown to most, but not to all." He unfolded the note. Written in her own hand, it reads, "She would not keep silent. But if I name her now, it will damn us both. Let the painting suffice. I have waited long enough. Let them come for me if they dare." There was a pause, a tension. Poirot's eyes gleamed. She had intended to stage a final act, to create a fiction so provocative it would draw out the guilty. Not of a long-forgotten murder, but of something far closer to home. All eyes now turned toward Miriam. She suspected someone in this house had a secret, one they might kill to protect, and in provoking them she lost her life. Constable Gibbs cleared his throat nervously. "Are you saying someone panicked and poisoned her?" "Just so. The poison was administered not in the tea, but beneath the decorative apple blossom placed on her saucer, a small amount of crushed bitter almond, cyanide, hidden beneath the petals, a careful, deliberate act, one designed not to fail." Reverend Drake leaned forward. "But who would have done such a thing?" Poirot's gaze swept the room, then fell again on Miriam. "I had long wondered why Mademoiselle Miriam appeared so composed when her aunt died so violently, but now I understand. She was not surprised. Miriam lifted her eyes. They were defiant. "You believe I killed her?" "I believe," Poirot said gently, "that you feared what she was about to say. Not because it was true, but because it brushed too close to your truth." Silence. Poirot continued, soft as silk. "You see, mes amis, the tragedy is not in the fake confession. It is in the true one that was never made." He turned to Constable Gibbs. "Yesterday, I received a second letter, anonymous, posted at the Lower Winsley office. It reads, 'She made it up, but she nearly ruined us. I only wanted her to stop. I didn't think it would happen so quickly.'" He removed it from his breast pocket. "Madame Hodge's handwriting, I am certain." Harold Seaton sat up. "But Edna, she wasn't even in the room when the tea was poured." "No," Poirot agreed. "But she was in the kitchen where she had access to the saucers. It was she who prepared the blossoms, and it was she who years ago witnessed something at Hawthorn Lane no one else saw." He turned to Miriam again. "Tell us, mademoiselle, how did your mother die?" Her voice was quiet now. She slipped down the stairs. I was 13. "Indeed. And yet Edna Hodge once claimed long ago that she heard a scream, that she saw Beatrice at the top of the stairs white-faced. Your mother's death was never investigated, but Beatrice always feared the truth would emerge, that her sister did not die accidentally, that perhaps she was pushed." Gasps. Reverend Drake turned to Miriam, appalled. "You can't mean—" "She didn't do it," Miriam said suddenly. Her voice was steady now. "It wasn't Beatrice, it was me." The room froze. I was angry, she continued. My mother had told me I would be sent away. She'd planned to remarry. I was to live with strangers. I tried to stop her from leaving. She pulled away. I pushed, and she fell. A beat. I didn't mean to, but she never moved again. Beatrice found me. She told the police it was an accident. Poirot nodded slowly. Beatrice protected you, but at a cost which, over the years, soured into resentment. She kept you close, but not with love, with obligation. Miriam looked up, eyes blazing. She punished me every day, quietly, coldly. And then she did this final play with the fake murder and the public shaming. She knew what she was doing. And Madame Hodge? Poirot asked. She overheard us arguing, the night before. I told Beatrice I'd leave. She said I was ungrateful, that she would never shield me again. Edna must have thought I would harm her, so she did it first. Poirot looked at Gibbs. She confessed in her own way, anonymously, but the poison is traceable. She will not escape justice. That evening, Poirot sat alone in the now quiet drawing room of Hawthorn Lane. The house felt emptier somehow. Another confession had surfaced, not of a stranger, but of a child who had grown into guilt. He whispered to himself, a false confession invited a murder. A real one revealed a life buried beneath silence. But only the truth sets it all to rest. Chapter 6. What Edna Saw. The following morning, grey mist hung low over the village, clinging to chimney pots and curling into the narrow lanes like smoke from a forgotten fire. At the station in Lower Winsley, a pale and shaking Mrs. Edna Hodge sat on a wooden bench with her handbag clutched like a lifeline. Constable Gibbs stood beside her, hat in hand, face unreadable. Across the desk sat Hercule Poirot, hands folded neatly, expression calm but penetrating. I didn't mean for her to die, Edna whispered, her voice cracking like brittle paper. I thought it would make her sick, frighten her, that's all. Poirot inclined his head slightly. Madame, such things are often said in remorse, and sometimes believed, but the facts, alas, are less forgiving. She stared down at the floor, where her stockinged feet sat slightly askew. The polish on her left shoe was scuffed. I saw them, you know, she said suddenly. Miriam and Beatrice, in the garden. Night before the tea, the girl was crying, saying she wouldn't be blamed anymore. Poirot nodded. You feared what might happen? No, Edna said bitterly. I feared what had already happened, and what might be revealed. She looked up, and for the first time, her eyes no longer darted away. I heard the scream the night Miriam's mother died, she said quietly. But I didn't speak up. I told myself it was none of my business, that people ought to mind their own grief, but Beatrice, she changed after that. Something in her went rigid, cold. Poirot observed her with quiet empathy. And you kept your silence all these years? What good would the truth have done? She snapped. It would have broken Miriam, and Beatrice had buried it so deeply, I think she forgot which parts were hers to bear. Poirot leaned forward slightly. And so you bore it instead? She nodded. At first, I thought Beatrice was going to tell it all. That's what the confession was for, the way she read it, so full of force. But it wasn't real. And when I realized it was just a game to provoke guilt, I was furious. It felt cruel. You feared Miriam might crack, Poirot said gently. I feared she already had. A silence fell between them, heavy as fog. I thought a touch of illness might stop the whole thing, give them all time to calm down, but she died, just like that. One petal, that's all it took. Poirot looked to Constable Gibbs, who cleared his throat. Mrs. Hodge, you will be formally questioned. You may wish to speak with a solicitor. She gave a wan smile. Don't bother. I've been holding my tongue for 30 years. I might as well speak now. Later that afternoon, Poirot walked the length of Hawthorn Lane, passing the iron gate with its peeling black paint, past the rose bushes that curled along the garden wall. Spring was returning slowly. But the house remained still, watchful, as though it too was listening. Inside, Miriam Langton was packing her aunt's books. She turned as Poirot entered, her expression unreadable. "I suppose you've come to ask if I feel any different," she said, holding a faded poetry collection. "No," Poirot replied. "I have come to return this." He handed her the torn corner of the original confession draft, the one he had found burned in the pantry. "You see," he continued, "your aunt was not going to name you, not in words. The painting, the letter, they were all designed to point towards someone else." Miriam frowned. "Who?" "Harold Seaton," Poirot said. She still held bitterness there. The original draft mentions him directly, but something changed. Perhaps she saw your distress. Perhaps she doubted herself. He watched her face carefully. "You think she protected me again?" Poirot said nothing. He let silence be the answer. Miriam turned away, placing the poetry book into a crate with trembling hands. "She made me feel like a ghost in my own home," she said quietly. "I never knew where I ended, and her guilt began." Poirot stepped closer. "You are not a ghost, mademoiselle. But you have lived in a haunted house, haunted not by spirits, but by silence. That, I think, is harder to banish." She gave a short, choked laugh. "What now?" Poirot gave a small shrug. "You must decide if you will continue carrying someone else's penance, or live your own life." That evening, Poirot dined alone at the Hare and Fern Inn, a modest plate of roast chicken and spring vegetables before him, largely untouched. The innkeeper had lit the fire early. Its glow flickered across the brass lanterns on the wall. From his waistcoat pocket, Poirot removed a tiny envelope. Inside it, folded twice, was a pressed sprig of apple blossom, now dry and faintly scented. The innocent thing that had held death. He stared at it a long moment. "One writes a false confession," he murmured. "One witnesses a crime and says nothing. One tries to fix a past too late, and one simply breaks under the weight of it all." It was not the most scandalous case he had solved, nor the most complex, but perhaps it was the most human. Chapter 7. The Lesson of the Apple Blossom. The rain had returned to Little Harborough by morning, falling in gentle sheets across the cobbled lanes and misting the windows of Hawthorn Lane. Within its ivy-wrapped walls, the old drawing-room felt smaller, as though the house itself had drawn inward in anticipation. Poirot stood before the hearth once again, turning slowly in his fingers a brittle, dried apple blossom, the same kind that had adorned every teacup the afternoon Beatrice Langton died. Only this one had not come from the garden. It had come from a box in her writing desk, sealed with black ribbon, marked in her delicate script, "April for memory." Inside, Poirot had found dozens of pressed blossoms, each carefully flattened, each labelled with dates. A kind of floral diary. April 1989, first spring alone. April 1995, Miriam's scholarship. April 2002, Edward's old journal burned. April 2010, Truth returns. Poirot had sat in silence as he read each entry. Beatrice had been keeping rituals of remembrance, small, private moments she alone understood. The apple blossoms weren't chosen for their beauty. They were markers, reminders of events she could neither forget nor forgive. And the final one? April 2023. The last confession. Later that morning, Poirot walked once more to the parish records office, where the vicar had granted him access to the church archives. He now searched not for names but for dates. Specifically, death records around April 1993. That was the year Miriam's mother died. Buried in an old burial register, he found it. Langton, Margaret Ann. Died 17, April 1993. Cause, accidental fall. Witnessed by E. Hodge B. Langton. Notes: daughter of Mary Langton, sister of Beatrice Langton. There it was. The paper trail Beatrice had quietly controlled. He closed the book gently. The confession she never wrote, the true one, had instead been buried beneath decades of apple petals. By midday, Poirot had requested that Constable Gibbs meet him at Hawthorn Lane. They sat in the parlour while Miriam remained upstairs, sorting what remained of her aunt's papers. Poirot laid a small cardboard tray on the table. "Do you recognize these?" Gibbs frowned. "Those are the blossom petals from the teacups. You had them kept aside." "Just so," Poirot said. "And here?" He opened a paper packet. "Are fresh samples taken from the same tree in the garden?" Gibbs looked puzzled. "They're the same." "No, no," Poirot said, eyes twinkling faintly. "Observe. The edge of these fresh blossoms is pale pink, slightly curled, whereas the one used on Beatrice Langton's cup was pressed flat, the edges browned. It came not from the garden, but from that box in her desk. And the blossom had been pre-prepared. Long before the day of the tea, it was no accident. She selected it for a reason." Poirot held up the pressed blossom between thumb and forefinger. It contained cyanide, not by chance, but by intention. She laced it herself. Constable Gibbs looked stunned. "You mean she poisoned herself?" "Precisely." The constable stared, eyes wide. "But why would she do such a thing?" Poirot sighed, folding his hands. To achieve exactly what she did, a final act of control. She did not wish to confess her own guilt, but to awaken that of others. Beatrice Langton staged her death as a murder, knowing it would cause those around her to confront what they had buried. "Blimey," Gibbs muttered. "That's dark." "Oui," Poirot said quietly. But she was a woman of precision. She timed it to perfection. Read the confession, drank her tea, collapsed. The poison was slow-acting, enough to allow for dramatic effect, but deadly nonetheless. But why use the fake confession? Why not just write the truth? Poirot looked toward the window, where rain tapped softly against the pane. Because the truth she most feared was not her own. It was Miriam's. Beatrice knew what had happened to her sister, but she never stopped protecting the girl. Not even when she began to hate her for it. Gibbs shook his head. So she poisoned herself to force someone else to confess. Poirot smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "No, mon ami, she poisoned herself to give meaning to a life where she had buried too much. It was theatre, a final performance, written and directed by a woman who wished to hold the last word, even in death." That evening, Poirot returned to the inn and requested a single candle for his room. He sat at the writing desk and laid out the evidence he no longer needed: the torn draft, the pressed flower, the photograph of the unknown woman in the school portrait. He turned the photo over. Written faintly on the back in pencil were the initials E.H. Eliza Hartwell. A name Beatrice had invented, or borrowed, or was it Edna Hodge, Edna Hartwell perhaps, a coincidence, or a final whisper? He smiled faintly. There are always layers, even in the petals. The following day, Miriam Langton left Little Harborough. She gave Poirot a letter at the gate, folded twice, sealed with wax. He did not open it until the train had vanished down the misty track. Inside, a single sentence. "For what it's worth, I think she forgave me in the end, and I hope I will learn to forgive myself." Below it, pressed flat, a single apple blossom. Chapter 8. The Truth in the Lie. The spring sun returned 3 days after Miriam Langton left Little Harborough. It broke through low clouds and laid a clean golden sheen on the slate roofs and crooked chimneys of the village. In the garden at Hawthorn Lane, the apple tree bloomed once again, oblivious to all it had witnessed. Inside, the house was quiet. Its occupants, once so tied together by memory, resentment, and unspoken truths, had departed. Only Poirot remained, standing in the drawing room where so much had unravelled. he studied the now empty side table where the tea service had once sat. On the wall above the mantelpiece hung the restored portrait Beatrice Langton had once hidden in her coal cellar. Two women painted in soft oils, one with sorrow in her eyes, the other with pride sharpened into bitterness. It was not signed. Poirot turned as Constable Gibbs entered, removing his cap respectfully. "She's been charged," Gibbs said. "Mrs. Hodge. She confessed in full to altering the saucer, but well, since Beatrice poisoned herself first." "There will be leniency," Poirot said quietly. Gibbs hesitated. "And Miriam?" "She left for Cambridge yesterday. A post at the library. She will not return here, I think." "No one ever thought she'd stay this long," Gibbs said with a shrug. "Bit of a shadow, that house." Poirot gave a faint smile. "Indeed, mon ami, but even shadows retreat in time." Gibbs paused. "Do you think Beatrice knew what she was doing? I mean, really knew?" Poirot's reply was slow, measured. She knew the poison. She knew the effect. But more importantly, she knew her audience. Beatrice Langton was a woman who had lived a life defined by restraint, and she wished her death to speak louder than she ever could in life. Gibbs frowned. "So, she didn't just want revenge. She wanted revelation." That afternoon, Poirot walked once more to St. Jude's Church, where the Reverend Drake sat in his garden, trimming the early roses. He looked up and offered a wan smile. "Come to see the confession play out to its last scene?" he asked. Poirot joined him on the bench. "It is not often I find a case where the victim and the orchestrator are one and the same." Drake nodded, shears idle in his lap. "I never knew the weight she carried. If I had—" "You could have done nothing," Poirot said gently. "Miss Langton had arranged her exit long before the tea was poured." The vicar said nothing for a long time. The sound of a robin chirping filled the silence. "You think she was a bad person?" he asked at last. Poirot shook his head. "I think she was a complex one, as are most of us. She protected a child who took a life, then punished her silently for years. She fabricated a murder to expose real guilt. She hid the truth until it could no longer be contained." He paused. "She sinned, yes, but not without purpose." That evening, Poirot prepared to depart. His bag was packed, his walking stick by the door. The landlady of the Hare and Fern Inn offered him one final pot of tea, which he accepted with a nod of thanks. As he sipped, he opened Miriam's letter once more. The apple blossom, now almost colourless, still held the faintest scent of spring. He thought again of the first confession, a fabrication, a fiction written to expose truths others dared not speak, a lie designed not to mislead, but to provoke. And it had done so. The truth, in the end, had not been a name in a journal or a photograph in a cellar. The truth had been in the fear it stirred, the memories it revived, the guilt it unearthed. Beatrice had weaponized memory, and in doing so she had forced her niece, her housekeeper, and even her former lover to confront the echoes they had buried in silence. Poirot stood, adjusted his cuffs, and murmured, "The past, mes amis, does not sleep. It lingers, it listens, and when provoked, it confesses." As the train pulled away from Little Harborough station, Poirot sat upright in his carriage seat, watching the village recede behind the veil of hedgerows and chimney smoke. He had brought no criminal to trial in the traditional sense, no handcuffs, no dramatic escapes, but he had exposed something older than murder, regret. And in its revelation, he had done what he always sought, to restore order, even amid the untidy truths of human hearts.